so much for inviting me here. One, it's very interesting walking down Martin Street because the cobbles are still as slippery as I remember them to be 30 years ago, which is slightly terrifying for any of you sitting there who are undergraduates. 30 years probably seems, well, it is a lifetime for you, isn't it? It's a lifetime plus. However, when you're at 30 years hence, it seems like yesterday. Seriously, I mean, it seems very odd walking down because I just remember it. And it's so evocative, particularly walking down Martin Street and nearly falling over cobbles. It's just how I remember it completely. So I'm going to talk about why I changed the title in a second. But what I'm going to try and do is just, part of the reason I changed the title is really to give you some insight in terms of how my time at Merton completely changed the direction I was going in. And so the atmospheric physics was key to that. But when I arrived, I wasn't an environmentalist. I was a kind of really junior physicist. I hadn't even heard of atmospheric physics. So for me, the journey really was, I'm going to take you through the journey I went on. I will talk about good energy. I'll talk about some of the science that I think is important going forwards and some of the challenges we have as society. And you entering into society, whether next year, the year after that, will be facing, because there are some pretty big ones out there. So I'm going to start with a quote by somebody completely different who says it much better than I do. So this is Ban Ki-moon, who basically talking about economic growth. And he's saying, saving our planet, lifting people out of poverty, advancing economic growth, these are one and the same fight. And for me, this is completely true. So if you start to look at the issues around climate, climate has such wide-ranging issues. It's not just about temperature. Sometimes we put it, the scientific side looks at temperature. It thinks about weather. But actually, it has a huge impact on society. If you start to look at parts of the world that become really difficult to live in, what's the impact of that? People have to move. You end up with refugees. You end up with huge economic problems because those countries become less economically viable. So for me, climate change is actually much more than just the science of climate, much more than just changing a weather pattern. It's about a wider economic impact. And I think this is going to be a real challenge for the next 30 years, a time when you come out of university, or maybe stay at university, start to research, start to do your own jobs, and think about actually what impact this is going to have on your lives. So I'm going to start. So I was trying to find a photograph of me when I started at Merton, and there was a very goofy photograph of me. I don't know what I was doing in the photograph. So left-hand side, I have a feeling I was probably not feeling as well as I should have done that morning. When I arrived at Merton, I was very excited, first of all, to be at university. Very, very excited. I've been to a girls' school. Suddenly I come to a college where it's a 7-to-1 ratio in men to women. Never have to buy a drink again. Things that were important to me. So I grew up in a world that was high carbon. So it was a really high carbon. We're talking about the 80s, really bad music and large cars, basically. So any of you want to look it up online, go back to the 80s and see what it all looked like. And I arrived, and the most important, I learned how to drive when I was 7. My father was a rally and co-driver, so I spent my world life going around motor race circuits. So it really was, when I say high carbon baby, I really was a proper high carbon baby. I liked fast cars. I think my first boyfriend I chucked because he couldn't change gear properly. Second boyfriend I went out with because he could. So that was my world, and that's how I was when I arrived at Merton. And I changed as I went through Merton. Physics was, well, I can't really say very much because Dr. Baker's here, so you'll remember there were certain parts I wasn't necessarily an ideal student. I did spend quite a lot of time probably playing for every sports team that Merton had at the time. But I got to my third year and I got the opportunity to study atmospheric physics. And suddenly for me, things became really interesting because I don't know why it clicked, why I found it interesting. The maths, if I remember rightly, was super difficult. Maybe that's why I liked it, I don't know. But it suddenly became really real world for me. Suddenly I started studying this, and the reality of atmospheric physics, the reality of climate change came back to me. And it was about the same time that it was beginning to be reported in the press, only very small snippets, that climate change might be an issue for society going forwards. And so those two things coming together for me were a real revelation. I started thinking about some of these numbers. So the fact that you've got the one on the right, which just shows change in CO2 emissions, change in temperature anomalies, and this one's much more interesting. This is the change in temperature. I'll let you watch it, but since, I said 1850, years that just moves and moves and moves. The science begins to show us what is actually happening. And this transforms some of these pictures, these ideas started to transform how I thought about the world and how I thought about what I was doing in it. And admittedly, I still drove my car, but I did start to think about what impact is it going to have when we see the change in temperature. So this is a change in temperature worldwide, and you can see nearly everywhere has got hotter. Nowhere's got colder in the last 5 years. And we have seen unprecedented change. I mean, 2016 is likely to be the hottest year on record, again. So that just means we're continuing in this direction. But despite all science, probably the man who influenced me most was this. Now, anybody who remembers, is old enough to remember this man. He is called Mr. Fish, and he was a weather forecaster in the UK. And in 1987, there was a massive storm that came through and wiped out half of the trees in the southwest and south of England, really massive storm. And he famously took a phone call. Apparently, I read afterwards that it was fake, that he didn't take a phone call, he made it up for the drama. Anyway, so he was meant to have taken a phone call live on air from a woman in the southwest who said, in the south, he said, we've got a hurricane hitting us. And he said, don't be ridiculous, there's no hurricane, it's going to miss the south UK, it's all be fine. And we studied the physics of the forecast that he got wrong, because actually it wasn't a hurricane, but it was a massive storm that hit the south and actually completely decimated the south. And what was really interesting about it was when you plug a load of data into atmospheric physics models, I'm sure you know that from any of the modelling you might have done, is that basically you've got a lot of variables that you can never get right. So the measurement of those are pretty, and people used to think that if you took a measurement from a boat, generally the boats tend to know where they are, but they're not very good at measuring the temperature, so they'd always allow for the temperature being wrong, but they would assume the guys would know where they were. There was one particular boat in the Bay of Biscay that was 100 miles north of where they thought it was. They plugged this piece of data into the model, and it spewed out the fact that the storm missed the south of the UK. And so for me, what was fascinating about that was just the sensitivity of impacts of climate and the sensitivity of weather forecasting. And really, kind of, we're dealing with a system that is, one, really difficult to forecast, two, really sensitive to different inputs, and three, if we continue to chuck the amount of CO2 into the atmosphere that we're doing, we're going to see an impact. And so it was him who really kind of made me think about it, despite the fact he got it wrong. So when I left Oxford, wasn't really anywhere to go, to be absolutely honest. I mean, I did look at getting a job in science, but most of them were lab technician jobs, and I was appalling. I mean, I have to say, that was my worst part of doing physics, in the lab work. I managed to blow up at least one lab, and I remember me and my practical partner running away, because we also blew up everybody else's experiments, so we were really, really unpopular on the second day of practicals. And so that really wasn't the direction for me, but what I wanted to do was kind of follow the thread. And when I say follow the thread, if you look at atmospheric physics and you look at CO2 emission rises, the next place you end up is the energy industry. You end up in the energy market trying to go, okay, so how does this impact? And what I felt was that I needed another tool to talk to people, to talk to business, to talk to politicians. And I did economics. And I was very lucky because Burke kind of does evening courses. So I used to work in the morning teaching maths and physics, and then go to college in the afternoon and do economics. And I have to say, it was great, because if you're a physicist, you've done all the maths, haven't you? And if you've done all the maths, statistics, comparison to economist students is pretty easy, to be honest. So I had a lovely time, because all the maths was relatively straightforward. And then I decided halfway through this to go and do an internship in the European Commission. And again, I was pretty lucky. I got to work in energy policy, which spanned everything across Europe. And I got to kind of really understand. I shared an office with a bunch of other interns who were from Statoil. I actually think they were spies from the Norwegian government, which actually they were. They used to have to go report to the Norwegian embassy every night. But they kind of explained to me how the whole oil pipelines worked. They explained how gas exploration worked. They talked about kind of the whole of the North Sea and how that had been exploited. I had to translate huge documents in French on security and supply, so I got to begin to understand different countries' points of view on energy, which was fascinating. The French never gave any information about nuclear power because they claimed it was a defence issue, so you could never find out how many nuclear power stations they really had. You got to look at a lot of maps, actually. The maps tell you a lot in energy terms, so if you ever fancy trying to figure out what's going on in energy, take a look at the maps. And gas pipelines. So there's a gas pipeline map of Europe. Most of it obviously comes from Russia, a bit down from Norway in different areas. Has anybody ever seen Dad's Army? Not the film, but the original series?
Yes.
So Dad's Army in the original series, there's an opening scene where basically Germany's coming in. There's an arrow map attacking the UK. Well, to be honest, the gas pipelines look exactly the same, because all the flows are going into the UK. There's nothing going the other way. And it is fascinating to kind of see, underlying all the energy policy that we listen to, how you can begin to understand what's going on, because you don't get it until you understand where every single country is coming from, what their resources are. Do they have coal? Do they have gas? Do they have nothing and therefore they have to import it all? And it completely impacts on their policies in terms of where they come from, where they go to. So it was brilliant. I love the European Commission, not only because they had great food, having come from Merton or slightly spoilt, I'm sure you still are today. One of the reasons I actually chose Merton was because of the food. And so it was that kind of thread, and it really gave me that fantastic view, because I didn't go to Europe thinking, I want to work on renewables. I went to Europe thinking, I need to understand energy more. And when I came back, what I thought was I need to understand, I quite want to work in renewables, because it answers so many questions. I'm going to show you a picture of the UK, actually, in terms of infrastructure. And one of the biggest challenges we have, I was talking about the European grid. This is the UK grid, and it's meant to be one of the best grids in Europe. In terms of, it's called the Rolls-Royce of grids when you talk to people who installed it. And it's a very sophisticated system, as you can see. We take a lot of power from the northeast and transport it down to London and the southwest. And actually, if you end up at the bottom here, you get charged much more than if you're up in Scotland, where you want it to go the opposite way. So it's quite a sophisticated piece of grid. But what's interesting about not just the UK, but European-wide, is all these grid and infrastructure systems were built for a high-carbon world. They were built for a world where you had large power stations with people on the end of the phone, and the National Grid would ring up the guys in any of the power stations in the northeast and say, hey, it's a bit cold this morning, can you bung it on please? Turn it up a bit. And they'd have levers and they'd switch these things on and off. And that's how this grid ran. It's how a lot of the European grid ran. And I want you to understand that, because when I start to try and put a renewable overlay, you can see how it conflicts so badly. So one of the things I did when I came back from Brussels is I went to hear a debate in the House of Commons. Has anybody been to the House of Commons? You should go. You should go with, yes, of course. But as a student, you should go. You should definitely go, because it's really interesting to see what is actually discussed and what isn't discussed. So I went to the House of Commons to listen to an Energy and Technology Committee talking about new energy technologies. So it'd be really, I was quite excited, obviously, a bit overexcited maybe. Low carbon technologies, CHP, combined heat and power, solar photovoltaics. Actually, they weren't talked about because nobody thought they'd ever happen. Wind power, lots of different technologies, energy efficiency. And I went to this committee, and it was probably the most disappointing and depressing thing I think I've ever been to. Because these guys, they didn't talk about the technologies, and I guess maybe looking back on it, maybe I was naive to think they might. They talked about the politics, obviously, because they are politicians. So what they talked about was, rather than thinking about the future, they wanted to stay in the past, which was kind of saying they basically had an argument about coal mining versus nuclear power. And they couldn't get their heads out of that was the paradigm they were in. So it was all about coal miners versus sort of clean sort of nuclear power. And that was it. That was all we got. We didn't touch the file that was there. It was that thick. I remember seeing it was an A4 file with all this stuff in it. And it wasn't debated at all. It wasn't even talked about. And I walked out of there going, this is so depressing. Because if you start, if you're there with the science and you look at climate change, and then you're there kind of with looking at all the possibilities and you look at the infrastructure we've got, you had to start thinking about new technologies to address this. And I just felt that the politicians were just way behind. And I might say that they're pretty still behind now, but they're better than they were. And that was why I decided to, well, it was a little bit more of a journey, to be honest, before I got there, but that was one of the reasons why I set up a company. And I set up a company because I wanted to try and do this. This is what I was trying to transit from. So from very large, that's large cooling towers, I think that's northeast, to a completely different model, a decentralised model. And as I said, would you picnic next to the first station or would you picnic next to the second? And for me, a low carbon future actually has many other benefits other than just changing from high carbon to low carbon. And good energy was about people. That's why I set it up. I set it up to bypass the politicians. Because what I believed in actually, there was people out there who got this. They got the fact that we were going to have to make this transition. They weren't going to be hugely political. They would just make simple decisions that they would want to buy power from renewable energy, maybe install power themselves, start to think about how they would move to a low carbon world. And when you run a company, what you find is the difference between kind of research, politics, and the kind of other area, which would be an NGO, non-government lobbying organisation, is that you are at the coalface. You're at the coalface where you understand how you make things work properly, economically. Because it's all very well when policymakers come in and say, we want to do this. And what you look at and say, well, that's not going to work. That's not going to work because it's going to overlay on top of this, and that person's not going to want that, or that person's not going to do that, because you've got a different economic model sitting behind. And when you're a company, you really come up against that. You come up against the little bolts that you have to change to make things really move forward. And that's one of the reasons I set it up, was not just to be about people, but also to be about trying to solve policy change. Because if you think about the infrastructure is about, historically has been about large centralised carbon-based fuels. And if in a renewable world, you move to a decentralised model, that means power stations much closer to where people are. Low carbon and zero marginal cost, which I know is a bit similar to nuclear, where in other words you haven't got any fuel costs. So it's a completely different model. And if you're going to change to that, you kind of need to understand how that's working at the front. So this is what sits behind the purpose of a company, and it's really quite wordy, and at some point I will pay somebody to do better words than I have on this. But what we did is we said, why are we here? And we talked about keeping the world habitable, because for me the issue with climate change is not that it's not going to happen or what itself, it's actually whether we can live on the planet with climate change, and what's it going to do to the habitability. And then there also make the UK more self-sufficient, because the issue for a country is if it spends a lot of money on importing energy, what you find is that it's then going to export something else. Because you have this constant, if you're going to pay for something yourself, you've got to then go and earn some money to pay for it. And a country is exactly the same. So if you import something, you've got to export something else. And I guess my concern is, what are we exporting to allow us to import? And actually we should be trying to be more self-sufficient so we don't have to export as much. It doesn't mean we shouldn't export, it just means we have more choice about what we export. Commercial model I've talked about, customers I've talked about, and then making sure the right framework. This is what the purpose of the company has always been. And it's been really helpful over the years, because it means that whenever you need to make a decision about what you do or what you invest in, you can come back to this every time and say, does it fulfill this? And if it doesn't, then you don't do it. So who are we and what would we do? So good energy is essentially a renewable electricity supply. So we buy power from different sites. So mainly wind at the moment, with solar, hydropower, that's kind of run-of-river hydropower, and biogen, which is biogas taken from anaerobic digestion, for any biology stroke chemists amongst you. And then what we do is we put that into the grid. So we buy power from around 1,200 generators across the UK, put that into the grid and we supply that to customers. So this is one of our customer service team who answers many questions through from, is my direct debit correct, to somebody's wired my solar panel in wrong. So this is kind of the organisation. The next part is we also develop renewables, so we're not just a buyer of power, we also develop our own. So about 25% of our power comes from solar and wind power that we've developed ourselves. And that is yet another challenge. So being a supplier is one challenge, and being a producer is yet another challenge in this marketplace. And finally, one of the things we've specialised in is allowing individuals to generate their own power. So we are the biggest, what's called feed-in tariff administrator. So we look after more people with solar panels on their roofs than any other supplier in the UK now. And what that means is, and for me this is kind of potentially the future, and it's a really disruptive technology because you don't need a small coal power station or nuclear power station in your back garden. You can put a solar panel on your roof. And all you really need to do is clean it and make sure the inverter's working and make sure that you might get some degradation over time, but for any lay person, it's not the end of the world having a solar panel on your roof, whereas anything more difficult is much more difficult. So this is the ultimate in disruptive technology in terms of the energy market. And it's really interesting how it then changes people. So what we found is that nearly 60% of people who put a solar panel on their roofs then changed their behaviour, started to think about when they use their power. I met somebody in Swansea who claimed, slightly unfortunately I felt, that he used to ring his wife up and ask her to do the ironing when it was sunny. This unfortunately was only a couple of years ago. But what it means is it triggers people's thinking into making energy real. Because most people in a home, if you think about, we're sitting in this room at the moment, it's warm and it's light. None of us are thinking about how we're doing that. How is it warm? How is it light? And I'm not saying we should, but because we never do, we don't think about how we use power. We don't think about whether there's a better time to use it or a worse time. We don't think about the impact we have when producing and using it at a particular time of day. And with people starting to put solar into their own hands, that's changing the psyche of individuals to begin to think about, actually, what does that mean? And I sort of said that we wanted to work with people because actually they were much easier than politicians or NGOs. We want to try and be a blueprint for how the world could be low carbon. One of the things of making a marketplace go from high carbon to low carbon is it's really difficult for them to think about a world that they might exist in the future when it doesn't really exist. And if you think of a company like an organism, if you think about it like that, if you try and change something, if you try and fundamentally change how it works and put that inside it, it tends to kill it. It's like an autoimmune system. And that's not because they don't want to. So you might have a CEO who does want to make the transition, but it's just people get scared of change. They find it really hard. And actually, the best way to do it is by kind of putting new companies out there who show the way, show the future of what it could look like. And several times I've talked to CEOs of the big 6 energy companies in the UK who thank us for existing because it means that they can tell their guys they don't need to fear. They can exist in this new world. And it will look different, feel different, but it doesn't mean they can't be there. So that's been really important. And although it doesn't feel we've been very radical, looking back on it, I think when I talk to people, we probably have, kind of the whole way we've gone about it. It hasn't been about buying power from big power stations. It's been buying power from small power stations. It's been about trying to change the way this market works altogether. And one of our biggest issues when we set up was raising money. So if any of you become entrepreneurs, the first thing you're probably focused on is who's going to invest in my project. And what's really interesting is you always have to remember that no piece of money is the same. So where it comes from is really important because it comes with strings attached to it. And I went to the city to go and talk to them about a green product. And of course, because they were a city, they loved, if you bought them an internet project back there, if you bought a web-based project, they give you huge amounts of money, which was then blown up in the bubble at the time. If you bought them something that was environmental, they went, what's that? Why would I invest in something like that? And so we had real difficulty persuading anybody to do anything. And in fact, our original money came from Germany because Germany was a bit further ahead. But by the time we really needed some more money, actually we had customers. And I used to sit very close to the call centre. And one of the most effective things I think on innovation is listening to what people say or what people need. Listen and listen again. And I used to hear conversations coming through saying, could we invest in the company? Could we invest in the company? And so I went, okay, well maybe we should let them invest in the company. How do we do that? And we set up, and the chairman and I think we'd been through various changes at this point. It's a long story and I'm very happy to talk about it afterwards. But I'd ended up re-phoenixing the company because the old company had gone into insolvency. So I ended up sort of starting from scratch again. And him and I, so we were really the only two people in the company, went and wrote this prospectus and sent it out to 3,000 customers. And we raised £600,000 in 2 weeks, which was amazing. I mean, it was really funny because he didn't believe it was going to happen the night before. I remember him getting cold feet and going, no, it's going to happen, come on, let's just do this. And it did, and so we were kind of one of the first crowdfunded energy companies, even though we didn't really realise it at the time. But it just made sense. It was the only people who really believed in us and what we wanted to do. And that made a massive difference, and it has made a massive difference to us always, is that one of the things I've really struggled with over the last kind of 5 years is we've got quite big, and actually spending time in the call centre and listening to what calls. So I sat on a call the other night when somebody called up, and on the feed-in tap, the guys who generate power in their own homes, we never installed any of that power, those panels, but we look after them, we look after the cash flow afterwards. Anyway, they rang up the call centre because they'd had an electrician in who was trying to put an electric shower in this person's house. And when he switched off the electricity, apparently he was still alive in the house. So obviously slightly scary. And the solar panel manufacturer wired it in wrong, so they crossed the wires basically, which meant the whole house was live even when you switched it off. Which was not ideal. So we ended up talking and said we found the installer, then we found their telephone number, and we put the electrician in charge to test with his number. But for me, what I'm looking at now is going, well, actually aftercare of these panels, making sure that somebody's got either an assurance or somebody checks them, is potentially a really important thing for people, and it will become increasingly important. So that's kind of one of the ideas we're looking at now. So it's quite fun being on a call centre. I recommend it. Listening to people and trying to walk in their shoes and understand what their problems are really powerful for ideas of change, new ideas to getting things. So how do we influence? So I haven't really touched on this. I wanted to sort of bring this a little bit back into the scientific world. So I sit on the council for something called the Natural Environmental Research Council. It's quite an interesting organisation. I can tell people more about that. I also did sit, I must admit, I've just resigned because I'm trying to spend less time outside the business, on something called Energy UK, which is the industry representative. So I sat as a board member on that. And I've sat on various steering groups on Ofgem, although I've got a bit fed up with that recently as well. Although I did go and talk to 800 staff and tell them they should put a solar panel on everybody's roofs. I'm not sure they'll listen to me, but if they really want to get customer engagement in this market. And I was also a founding member of something called Powerful Women. And these things, it's quite interesting when you become an innovator in the market. Actually, I could probably speak at a conference once a week if I really wanted to. However, one of the things you have to resist is going to speak at millions of conferences, because actually you need to speak to your own staff quite a lot, and you forget that you must spend time in the business as well as outside it. So I choose a few, which is why I'm talking to you tonight, which is very exciting. And I do the ones I really want to do. But it is important trying to kind of look at some of these outside bodies and what their research. So in research, what are they researching? In energy, what are they influencing? In the regulator, what are they regulating? And in Powerful Women is about trying to get 15% of the people who work in energy are women. And it'd be quite nice to have a bit more of a balance, would be my view. You just get different questions, you get different thoughts coming through. And I think it'd be more fun, to be honest, for everybody. So one of the things about something like NERC, what's really interesting is you look at some of the science that they're doing and how impactful. So if I look back at my career and how actually learning about science made a massive difference to where I started as a high carbon baby through to looking at a low carbon lifestyle and world that I work in. And I was really lucky to sit on the awards for NERC in their first year, which was really exciting. There was one of the economic, somebody from Manchester University presented this water and gas monitoring, and it would seem to be very simple to me, to be honest, but for the water, for the gas water market particularly, most water pipelines, most of the water companies don't know where the holes are. They have no idea what's going on. So this kind of monitoring equipment is incredibly powerful in terms of making sure that they don't get huge leakages. The butterfly conservation was really fascinating. This is obviously an impact of climate change as we're seeing biodiversity significantly reduce. And this was the first time they've managed to really understand the multiple impact of biodiversity on this particular butterfly. It's a butterfly that lays its eggs and gets, oh God, I can't remember now, gets something else to look after them basically. It's a bit like a cuckoo. It's an ant, that's right. So they trick the ants to look after their eggs. And you've got to have the ants and the butterfly and a particular type of time. And if you don't have all of those three, your butterflies disappear. And so it's kind of the first time they've actually figured out the whole piece, this piece of research, and how they're now sort of influencing that around the world. Another piece of research was extreme weather warnings, which I'm really interested in because the storms, wind turbines behave very differently. And actually understanding how a storm might go across the UK will significantly impact on how the output from wind turbines are going to impact on the energy market. And the final one was there was the ozone impact, which was huge. I mean, that piece of research had a massive impact in terms of what we did in industry and in regulation on aerosols. So one of the things in science and climate science and technology, we see huge leaps moving forwards all the time. One of the biggest issues is the political challenges and short-termism. And as I said, that was why I set up the company in the first place. But what we're seeing now is we are seeing some movements. The Paris Agreement was the first time we've seen the UN actually sign up to anything. So I don't know if anybody knows about the Paris Agreement or how much you know about it. But essentially, what was really interesting in it was if you try and get countries to all agree to the same thing, it never happens. So that's what they've been trying for nearly 20 years, I think. What they did in Paris was different. They got each country to say what they would do. And if you look at the economic system and the energy system of every country around the world, it is completely different. So they have complete biases. So Australia will always want to have coal in the mix because they have huge coal reserves. Somewhere like Russia will always want to have gas in the mix because obviously they export gas to the rest of the world. So you've got these different views. And by actually asking them to come up with their own policies rather than doing a top-down one, that's why I think Paris got over. And I have to say the French civil servants did an amazing job in terms of getting this through. And I think hats off to them. And one of the things that's really difficult and continues to be really difficult is if you talk to individuals about their lives are kind of, you've got three layers really. Their lives are today, and I'm sure you're thinking about the things that impact on your life today, whether you've got a tutorial tomorrow, whether you're going to get supper tonight. Those are things that we kind of see immediately in front of us. The next layer is kind of something maybe affecting our society locally, or maybe the college, or maybe the community you live in. And we can relate to that. You move to a planetary level that becomes incredibly difficult to get as an individual because you spend your life in those other two areas much more. And trying to get people to understand a global risk where you don't necessarily feel the impacts day to day is really hard. And that's one of the most difficult things I think that any organisation, and this whole piece around climate change has been, because it's such an international problem, but the local impact for many people who are actually influential in it is so small. So what's really exciting in the energy market at the moment is that we're seeing this evolution from sort of older technologies through to the newer technologies. And I think that must be a CCGT. This gives you a picture of what's happened in the energy market. So this is the 1960s, and you can see in the 1970s we built a lot of coal in the UK. Nuclear we built up really till sort of mid-90s. Then gas became very important as a technology. And you see renewables at the bottom has only really started to come in the last 5 or 10 years. So you can see a hugely changing energy system in the UK. And just last year, so this is the change between 240 and 250, the figure to really look at is the switch between coal and renewables. That's what's happened. And I remember going to a renewables conference, which had quite a lot of renewables industry in it, and it was in a small pub in North London. Okay? Very small. Renewables now produce nearly 25% of the UK's electricity. And still, people don't really get that. They don't really see the speed of this transition that we've seen over the last couple of years. And what's going to happen next? So what's going to happen next is we're going to start to see the next impacts. So with renewables on the system, the biggest challenge for the system, and the biggest challenge for the national grid right now, is the fact that they don't necessarily know when it's going to be there. So there's various things they have to get better at. One is weather forecasting, to know whether the power is going to be turning up or whether it's not going to be turning up. And two is control, and actually how they can control that and how they can take load off the grid. So the biggest issue National Grid has at the moment is that we put 13 gigawatts of solar power on the grid in the last 2 years. One, they don't know where it all is, and two, they have a max peak in the summer, which is now potentially too much, so they have to reduce load. They've never really had to do that before. They've never had to take load off the system because they've got so much solar. And one of the reasons they haven't really thought about this, and I met the head of National Grid about 5 years ago, is they never really got what we call decentralised energy. Because with anything below 50 megawatts, you plug it into the local distribution grids, you plug it into the low voltage grids. So National Grid doesn't see it, doesn't know it's there until it starts impacting on it. And so they've been blindsided by particularly the solar market. And what's going to be really interesting, and I think this is going to be the next innovation we're going to see definitely is storage. So storage is going to be the next thing we see starting coming through. And the reason it hasn't been there is, one, we haven't had the cars, and two, we haven't had the need in the energy sector to really see storage coming through. This is what we've seen in terms of battery costs, and the original cost projections out to 2040 was kind of around 400. We're already seeing Tesla Powerwall come down to 350 today. And that's just been the fact that they build a massive great factory. That's one of the key things that's changed in this technology. And I think we're going to still continue to see huge amounts of change in terms of the technology itself, the capability of those people who are producing it, and actually what people are interested in. So if you've got a solar panel on your roof, you really want to put a battery next to it in energy terms. Not necessarily financial terms yet, but in energy terms. Because most of the time, most people aren't at home in the middle of the day. That's when you're going to get maximum peak. And what you really want to do is store that and use that when you get home from work. And these are the kind of smart homes that we're going to start to see. And I think then we're right at the cusp at the front of it, but we're beginning to see that come through. In terms of solar deployment, if you look at what was expected in solar, I sat in a lunch with some of the big energy guys, big CEOs of the energy companies, and Vince Cable, I think it was. And Vince Cable asked us about solar, and the guy from Centrica said, "Oh, solar's not going to work in the UK, it's not sunny enough." If you look at the deployment in the UK, not just the UK but worldwide, you can see that it's completely outmatched anything anybody thought was going to happen. And part of that was because of the Chinese coming in and just bringing the price down. And the second part of that is that we've just seen the technology improve and improve. And the third part, it's really easy to deploy. So I can build a solar park. We're building one in North Devon at the moment. We can build a 5 megawatt solar park in 3 weeks. So in terms of the technology, if you think about something like nuclear, it's going to take you 12 to 15 years to build a nuclear power station, but you can deploy solar really quickly. And that's what's really interesting in this, is that at the point when solar comes down in price, that every household in the UK could afford to have it, you're going to completely disrupt the system. And National Grid really won't know what to do with it. And at that point, we're really going to need all the rest of the technologies to deal with it. I'm sure some of you have seen this. For me, what's really interesting on this is a solar cell going into a classic system in the UK with AC current, alternating current. And we've built it all around taking high voltage, moving power around the UK, and then taking it down to low voltage. And that's why we've used alternating current mainly. So in the household, most of the time, if you think about these, or you think about your phones, you could plug them straight in. You don't need to use an inverter. So suddenly we could start to think about wiring our houses. Do we need to wire our houses in the same way that we have today? We've wired our houses in that way because of an old system. But in a new system, you could completely rewire your house and have two systems. One for anything that was heating or needed heat, and one for anything that needed electronics. And suddenly you've got a new world that looks very different, much more energy efficient. Now I'm not even going to try and explain this. Those of you who know about this piece of research that's been going on, which is looking at a completely different way, not using silicon, and improving the efficiency of solar cells. What's been really interesting about this that struck me was that silicon, anybody who remembered Betamax and VHS in video, the youngers of you may not, but it's about a choice of technology. So before CDs and before DVDs, we used to have video, and there was a choice at one point between two technologies. One was VHS and one was Betamax. And the Betamax was a better technology, it was more efficient, it had much better quality. But the VHS won because people built factories that produced VHS before they did build Beta. And we're in a little bit of the same situation with this, is that all the factories that are being built are around silicon PV. So if you're trying to introduce a new technology at this point, it's very difficult because the manufacturing is stuck with an infrastructure. What's interesting is, I'm not even going to try and pronounce it, the new technology, this one on the right, is that you can actually put it in really thin layers and lay it over the top of silicon and increase the efficiency of it. Now that is a real innovation, because what it means is you don't have to stop producing silicon, but you can improve the efficiency of silicon. What I'm really excited about is whether I can retrofit all my solar parks and improve the efficiency by putting thin little films of these on top. And that would be really exciting, because you can use a new technology on existing technology and upgrade it. And those are the kind of research pieces that we kind of are seeing going forwards. So low carbon world is going to look pretty different. It's going to look, rather than large power stations connected to lots of houses, it's going to be the house has become a focal point. It's going to be potentially where you produce energy, where you store energy. And when you use energy, you're going to be basically trading with the grid. I'm going to show you a small video, which is, we've called it something different, but it was based around a whole visualization of understanding this kind of Internet of Energy, how you start to actually cut out the middleman, which is ourselves, and actually go directly so people can buy power directly. They can select where the power comes from. And it starts to change people's behaviour. It starts to make them think about whether they can stop using energy at 7 times a day.
For the first time
In the UK,
You have the power
to select your power.
because we are changing the way.
Your electricity is sourced.
This is decentralised.
This is local.
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 local,
Local.
This is national.
this is 100%
Renewable.
Wind.
Solar.
Hydro.
zero
carbon.
Good energy.
From across
The UK.
This is your choice.
This is Selectricity.
Electricity.
Selectricity.
enabling you to deliver
Your corporate social responsibility goals.
And bring to life your organisation's commitment to zero carbon emissions.
together.
Together,
Together,
We are
good energy, electricity.
So that is the end of my talk, actually, if I can persuade it to go forward. Thank you very much for listening. What we're trying to show there is actually the future is not just about technology, it's about people and technology. And low carbon will look very, very different. We asked the question about picnics earlier, and would you picnic in one of the places that you saw in here? The answer is probably yes. Would you picnic next to one of the traditional power stations? Probably no. And this is one of the biggest challenges, actually, is one of the things for me that I love about renewables is that renewables offer us low carbon. They offer us low carbon that is based here in the UK, so we use our own sources and import less. But they also offer it in a way that we can still live around it. You can put a solar panel on your roof and you can sleep well at night. So thank you very much for listening. I was trying to go to the next slide, which says questions, but I'll just say the next slide says questions. So thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me back to give this lecture.
Thank you, Juliet, for this very high energy talk. High energy, but low carbon. And we'll throw it to questions. We have a lot of time to examine the case as it were. So, please.
Yeah, sorry, could you explain how those thin films work then, the guys that you overlay over the silicon panels? How do they
So
work?
that is the detail that I may not be able to get into, but I can pass you to the Oxford researcher who is actually working on it. So as far as I've understood, is that you basically have, if you look at the silicon film, what you do is you layer it on top, and it has an amplifying effect in terms of how it moves through, how these semiconductors work. So it's a layering of the semiconductors that you still get an improvement in efficiency of the first one without having to make it fully perovskite, basically.
And you're saying that potentially you could put these films over every single PV that...
That could be one potential way of looking at it. I mean, the issue for me is when you're moving to a new technology, one of the things I'm trying to explain was that you end up with the infrastructure of the old technology interfering with the new technology. And even in a new technology like solar, you're beginning to interrupt with any new... So the fact that silicon got there first is now stopping new ideas coming through. And you're always going to have that competing, is because whatever technology has managed to get there first and get the economics working, it will try and crowd out any new one, because you're not just going to close all those factories and start again because you've got an investor cost in that. And that's why if you can get the two to work together, you've got much more opportunity, basically.
You mentioned that ideally you want to be able to store the energy from solar power. How far off do you think we are being able to do that?
So right now, I mean, you've got the Tesla battery there, which is a 5 to 6 kilowatt battery. That would store about enough. So if you've got 4 kilowatts of solar panels in the home, which is producing too much for the average household during the daytime, that battery would be able to save it. And it's there already. I mean, you could put one in your wall now. I have a Moxia at home, which is a different type of battery, which I've been testing. I've worked out it actually costs me money to install it. Because actually what it does is that particular battery is supporting the grid, so it's not actually helping my house very much. And I don't produce enough solar to do that. The issue is the economics. So the payback for that right now is about 20 years. You need to get it down to 5 to 7 really to start to make it work. And that's what we're going to have to see is some... The real opportunity is in the household is you save power during the day, so you take out that solar peak in the midday and put it into the 5 to 7 period when you're at home doing most things. But you also use it and you do it, you aggregate it across hundreds of homes and sell it into the national grid as a service. So you sell it as a frequency response service, which begins to then get other income flows to it, which you can then give the householder. And makes it more economic. So you're going to have to start to looking for other income flows to make it work, other than just this solar power access.
I was recently reading a little bit about Tesla's. They've got these roof tiles that basically you can install in the home, and they're all solar panel roof tiles, right? How viable do you think those are, and what's your opinion of them, etc.?
So the roof tiles have been around, so Tesla isn't new in this. I mean, roof tiles have been around for quite a long time, and the reason people developed them is because they thought solar panels on roofs were ugly. So you've got this constant balance in our world of kind of environmental impact in terms of whether they're ugly or not, and nice. So the solar tiles are there really to try and pretend that there's no solar panel on there originally. They work, they're not as efficient as solar panels, and they're more expensive. So they look nice, so if you're happy, so it's a bit like sort of choosing how you're going to do your bathroom. You're going to have marble or you're going to have vinyl. It's that kind of choice, and so it's a luxury product right now, really, because it's all about what it looks like rather than what necessarily performs. But, I mean, again, the cost will come down the more they produce, and Tesla is all about brand. It's all about what it looks like, which is really important as well. I mean, I should think most people here have heard of Tesla. Most people probably haven't heard of Sonnen, which is actually the biggest producer of batteries, small-scale batteries in Europe for households. But nobody would have heard of them because they're not a brand. But they are very big and they are very efficient. So Tesla's done an amazing thing in terms of making a brand out of something quite dull. But the problem with that is it doesn't always work as well as you'd like it to.
American college is even better at that. Please.
how are these renewables going to tide us over like winter where you don't get enough solar power and the consumption is high?
So I think what you've got to look at is a future where you get a mix. So solar and wind actually work very well together. So you get much more production of wind in the winter than you do in the summer, and much more production of solar in the summer. What you need is, so a lot of people have got sort of caught up in trying to do seasonal storage. I store power in the summer and then use it in the winter. You don't really need to do that. If you start looking at integrated systems, you can, as long as you can store interday, probably for up to a week, you can start to see different systems. So one of the most exciting things I saw recently was a heat storage system. So you take excess electricity when you've got too much electricity, and you put it into a heat storage, and that can store for up to a month in terms of producing hot water. So you're beginning to work between two different marketplaces. And you've got another one is hydrogen. So if you look at a fuel cell, you can start to take off. So in the UK, we constrain wind off. About 7% of the total wind production is constrained off. So there's too much wind at certain times. So they constrain off, they pay it to constrain off, which means that there's 7% of wind power we're not using. It could be there, but we don't use it because it's too much at the time. If you put that into a hydrogen system, you could either then use that. So there is storage in the gas grid. You can already mix up to 5% of hydrogen into the current gas grid because of the appliances. And you could upgrade that, but right now you can put 5%. So if you took that excess electricity, convert it into hydrogen, because obviously it wouldn't be, because it's switched off, it's almost a free resource. Put it into hydrogen and then put it into the gas grid. You've got storage in the gas grid. So you can begin to look at, see whether you can use different systems across the piece and how you cross across that. I mean, the other part is transport. So we're already seeing hydrogen fuel cell cars. There's a company called ITM Power who are developing, I think they put hydrogen refueling stations around the M25 now, and they're beginning to start to put them down the M4. And so suddenly you've got a different marketplace. So if you've got excess in one place, maybe you can put it into another market. And any other fuel hydrogen you can store as well in a transport sense. So that's when you begin to see how you can, an integrated system. It's much more complicated than the previous system, don't get me wrong. But this is why we're going to need much more automated systems, better systems for forecasting, and better systems for pulling power out of one system into another. But if we do that and we start to develop infrastructure that's based around that rather than based around a high carbon infrastructure, you can see that transition quite well.
On a kind of, you described your company as a non-governmental but lobbying organisation.
No, it's not a non-governmental organisation is something like Greenpeace.
Okay.
So we are a company, but we do lobby. So I have a public affairs team and I have a regulatory team.
Okay.
We spend a lot of time getting into the details. So the whole of the energy market works on something called the Balancing and Settlement Code. It's a really dull document, it's about 500 pages. A slight change in there can fundamentally change the economics of any of these power stations. So understanding how that works, and when civil servants start to take that apart and change it, will change the complete economics. So you have to be all over that and really understand how that's working. Right now they've just changed it, which makes wind power less valuable in the marketplace. So we're going to have to do something else to put, and storage begins to have more value. So it means that I might be looking at putting storage on site on my wind farms to try and improve the overall value of those.
I mean, I was going to ask about something like, I was going to ask about how you found that the attitude of governments towards receiving this kind of lobbying from such organisations has changed over time. You talked about
yeah, it has a lot. It changes constantly. So every time you get a new energy minister, there was a period where the UK had had 10 energy ministers in 10 years. And the biggest issue is that traditionally energy hasn't been a sexy industry. So it hasn't been one that politicians have gone, yes, I'll have energy. And that hence the revolving door. And what that means is that none of them really understand their brief, so they don't really get into it. And the last set of energy ministers we had, up until Brexit, was a set who didn't get the technology, didn't get the marketplace, and were focused on the social side, which is fine, But actually what you want is an energy minister who can deal with the people bit as well as the technology, as well as the market piece. And so what they end up doing is tinkering with all the regulation of this area, trying to make their name in that area, and they completely don't focus on that. So nothing's happening, or the market's just getting out of control in those two areas. So have they got better? It goes in waves, to be honest. We had a pretty good Secretary of State under the coalition government, and actually that was when we saw renewables change a lot. However, they did tinker too much, so they probably didn't really think. So they introduced the legislation to support solar panels in people's homes. What they didn't think about is the impact it could have on the wider market if it was successful. So it was much more successful than they ever thought it was going to be. So what they should have done is brought in a piece of legislation that incentivised people to balance that power, so that you had storage coming in as well at the same time as solar. And then you would have had a much better solution come out. And that's the problem with regulation. It quite often focuses on one problem. It's quite siloed. It doesn't think about system problems. It thinks about individual problems and individual solutions, which becomes a real problem. So I would say, has it got better? It goes in waves. So right now it's not great at all.
Does it go in waves with whoever's in power?
Yeah, no, completely. And they all have their biases. They all have their complete political biases, depending on what they believe in their hearts. So it's, yeah, that's your other problem.
I was surprised to see that there wasn't so much hydroelectric power being generated in the UK, because it sort of provides a natural solution to this baseline problem that renewables objectors so often object about. Is that just because of geographical reasons, or is it?
So it's a kind of combination. To build something called like Davenport, which is a massive pump storage hydropower station in Wales, they had to flood a whole valley. They had to move villages. You can't do that anymore. You decided you wanted to go and take out a valley in some part of Wales or Scotland. Politically, you just couldn't do that anymore. So those options have really gone. So those power stations are still running. I can't remember when that was built, 50, 60 years ago. Those power stations are still running and still doing really well. In terms of river power, hydropower, actually it's not as baseload as you would think it was. It's more difficult to predict than wind power. So looking at how much power, because what you have is the combined effect is if it rains and what the catchment soil is. So if you've got clay as opposed to limestone, the runoff is much quicker, depending on which one it is. And so trying to figure out what the forecast on that is really, really hard. Our guys have a really tough time. I keep going, surely it's easy, and they keep going, no, it's not. And so that, and also we've done a lot of abstraction. So from water companies, I come from a region which was built on water mills. So it's a whole industrial area built on water mills. There was not enough water in those valleys now to produce hydropower, because you've had all the abstraction licenses from the water companies have taken the water out to deliver to our homes. So there's not as much water running through some of the rivers as there was previously. One of the big opportunities, and I have a slight bias on this because we're invested in it and also my husband runs it, is tidal lagoons. So that is the equivalent of using tides to produce hydropower. So it's a very similar technology. So essentially you put a big tidal wall in the water, and it fills up during high tide, and then you wait till the tide goes out, and then you let the water out. It's like a big bath, basically. And that is a real possibility, because you don't have to flood any valleys. And we've got great tidal resources here in the UK. And actually, if you put them around the UK, you can almost get a base load, because tides obviously in the south are different than they are further on in the north. So that is a really interesting technology. We're hoping, fingers crossed, that this government, we don't know, will actually give it a thumbs up and let it go forwards.
So if we could only solve the storage problem, all of you who only have baths rather than showers, generating energy every morning by just letting the water out. Was that the case when you were a student here?
Baths. There were some people who loved their baths and some people who didn't. I don't think we had one actually in our corridor.
Please.
With the increasing demand for power in the developing world, surely it's going to be very important that in the future they transition to sustainable sources of power. So I was wondering if there was anything you could say about the difficulties that they would face and possible ways these could be
It's very political as well. So if you look at the development banks, they have a tendency to want to bring investment into technologies and infrastructure that we've already used in Western Europe. So that is a big hurdle. I mean, what you really want to do, so if you look at the telecoms market, what's happened in developing countries is they haven't gone for line, they've gone for mobile immediately. So they've made that leap, that technological leap. And what's interesting is I think energy companies are quite well into some of the developing countries. So they're trying to lobby to put infrastructure in which embeds their technologies. And actually you could make that leap. So if you put solar or you put solar lamps, you look at actually what those households need, you could look at an off-grid system quite quickly. But unfortunately, again, it's the politics of it all. So you have to start looking at the UN level in terms of how you start influencing that. It's not straightforward, but the technology is there. It's just how you get the investment into it and how you persuade people to come and put money into that. Whereas in big infrastructure, it's much easier to get your money back than it is if you put in a decentralised infrastructure. But we should do it, is the answer.
Hands up. Okay, let's do Catherine.
How much like big companies like Centrica and Empower are now investing in renewable energies? Is that becoming a big thing for their employees?
Yeah, so I mean, I think if you look at a company like E.ON, I would say, it's probably one of the most interesting examples. So they were the first company to decide to remove their coal assets and their high carbon assets from the rest of the business. So they split the business in two. And so they now have renewable business plus the supply business. So customers and renewables are together, and then the high carbon business is separate. And part of that is just how those two businesses behave. One of the things they were really struggling with is if you think of businesses as people, that's how you have to think about them. If you're a coal power station, you were sitting there representing a coal power station, what would your behaviour be to legislation? It would feel very different than if you're sitting in a renewables business. And so one of the issues, if you run both of those, you're constantly conflicted all the time when you're talking to politicians or civil servants. So that's one of the reasons they've separated them. And they see the future as the renewables part and the past as some of the high carbon part. And that's why they've done that. I joke with the guy who runs E.ON that he's become more like me. He obviously doesn't take it very well. He's a mathematician. Wouldn't I apologise?
Jason, you have the question.
If you go back to one of the initial graphs that you had at the beginning of your talk, where it was really just a picture of the world from 2011 to 2015 and the change in temperatures, this is probably just a basic physics question, but why is the change in temperature accentuated the further you go north? So at the poles it's a lot.
To be honest, I don't know. I mean, I could make it up if you wanted me to.
Yeah,
yes.
And I can try and figure it out. I must admit, that was the first time I've seen that slide, so it's the first time I've kind of thought about that question. It's probably to do with the fact that the Antarctic is slowing the system in the south, whereas the Arctic is because it's melting faster, you're getting a heating in the north. It's probably to do with the poles and the pace of change, basically.
So what they're actually measuring there, right, it's not like the ground temperature, it's the air temperature at sea level, right? Is that?
I think so, yeah.
Measuring?
Yeah, and I mean, what you're definitely seeing, I mean, where you're seeing the biggest impacts is, so in the UK, obviously, rain is one of our biggest impacts, precipitation. So if you look at the big floods that we had, was it this spring in Cumbria, the massive floods, did everybody? And apparently that is because that landmass is just so wet now, it can't cope with any more rain. And the head of the Met Office basically said you can directly put that. So one of the biggest issues you always have with climate scientists is that they don't want to say one particular event is linked to climate change, because obviously you can't scientifically prove that. And it's one of the biggest problems when you put climate scientists on the radio and you get somebody asking them a question, they can't answer that question. And so it's the believability outside becomes very hard because individuals who aren't scientists want yes or no answers. They don't want, well, you can't link the two. But this is the first time we've seen actually somebody go on live and link climate change to that particular event. And that's a real change, and it's much, one of the biggest issues they've always had. I went to a climate science and communications lecture in a conference in Cambridge years ago, and we had a classic, so there's a bunch of journalists in the audience, and there's two climate scientists, and they were arguing, so they had a couple of lines up there about future forecast of temperature, and they were arguing between two lines. Now, the fact that lines were both going upwards kind of bypassed them. They were arguing about which one. The thing about the journalist is the thing they would take away is climate scientists disagree. Not that they agree that both lines are going up, but they disagree on the output of science. And this has always been a slight clash between sort of climate science reporting and the actual science itself.
But considering that we now live in the post-truth era, this will unshackle the climate scientists, right? And present all these further opportunities. Questions? Please.
I don't know if this is asked. I mean, how much do you worry about the Trump administration? as we're talking about.
Well, I mean, I worry about it for many reasons. Sort of, not least the sort of progression of society as a whole. But in terms of what we do, I mean, what's interesting is I think that there will be a bunch of people who are just massively depressed by this. And I think if you look at what's happening in politics, actually turning to politicians for our ethics becomes much less the place that we look. And I think there's opportunities for organisations like ours with a purpose to actually fill some of this space, because we can't lie. We're not allowed to. We get sued. Whereas if you look at, if you looked at the Brexit campaign in the UK, all the stuff that those people campaigned on, because none of them were elected afterwards, didn't matter what they said. So when was it a campaign bus that had how much we put back into the NHS if we exited Europe? There's complete fictitious figures. But it doesn't matter because you can't sue them, you can't take them to the advertising standards agencies. So what's really interesting about companies is you can do that. So if somebody lies as a company, you can take them to advertising standards agency. There's a whole lot of regulation in place. So I wonder whether we're going to work in a world where actually politicians can lie but companies can't. So do you end up trusting companies more? And I think it's really interesting.
Already.
Sorry?
People trust brands much more than they trust companies.
Yeah, well, I agree, but I think it might happen even more now than ever before. So am I depressed by it? Yes. Do I then try and look at the silver lining? Yes.
Well, while you're thinking of more questions, could I ask a question as well? So you couched the beginning of your talk in terms of how you arrived here and how this physics education, which culminated in atmospheric physics, was a motivator for doing what you then did. But besides being a motivator, was it actually useful?
Great question. I mean, it's really interesting as you go forwards in time and you look at, so as I look back in terms of what I always remember studying physics is that you had to suspend the fact you didn't understand stuff quite a lot. So if you start reading the book on quantum physics, you're not going to get it first time, or whether you get it ever. And so you do a lot of things in physics where you haven't got all the understanding all the way through. And in that sense, it's incredibly different from being an engineer, where engineers tend to
understand nothing.
You tend to build things, and it's really interesting in business is that one of the biggest challenges of organisations is so we call it the 4 quadrants, where you have the known knowns, you have the known unknowns, the unknown knowns, and the unknown unknowns. And most people tend to want to work in the known knowns because they get that. They like being there. And you can sometimes push them into these 2 quadrants here, but they kind of want to gravitate back there. And actually, if you want to change something, if you want to truly innovate, you have to work in the unknown unknowns. You have to work in something you don't know how to solve and be happy to sit with something you don't know how to solve and let it come, rather than trying to make a decision too quickly. We came across this quite recently we have a development business that builds solar parks and wind farms, and the government completely scrapped all the legislation that was supporting that. And the team who were doing it are kind of looking at us going, oh my God, too good to do. We can't exist in this new world. And I spent a long time with them trying to hold them in this fourth quadrant, saying, listen, just sit with it, don't panic. Because as soon as you start panicking, anybody who does any brain science, you start working in the part of the brain that kind of is execution, so you can't think, you're kind of in the limbic brain. Whereas actually what you want to do is be in the creative brain, you need to stop panicking and step back. And I think as a physicist, actually, you have to spend your life doing that, because anybody in this room who tells me they understand everything they ever learned as a physicist, well, I never did, I have to say. And I spent most of my time being the unknown unknown. But it's incredibly useful in terms of capability, because if you try to move to that quadrant the whole time, you can run something that maybe builds something from bottom up, but you can't ever be imaginative and take a big leap in terms of what you might do next.
All right, fine. Go ahead.
So if Theresa May called you up and said, tomorrow you're going to be the UK Energy Minister, and I want you to come up with 5 things that we need to do now that would really, allow us to transition to a better renewable energy system, etc. What are the 5 things, or a number of things that you would do?
So really dully, the first thing I started to do was to look at the low voltage network system we have, and the high voltage network system, and get them talking to each other, so that we can start to look at balancing the grid in a much more creative way. Because at the moment, national grids, which run the big ones, the high voltage lines, don't talk to the local grid. I don't know whether it's a snobism, I don't know what it is, but they don't talk to each other. So when they come out with a bunch of contracts, they don't think about the constraints they cause on each other, so the costs go up. So actually making sure that they actually talk to each other and they work together to come up with a much better system. I would basically figure out how you get the value of balancing the system economically to come through to householders and smaller businesses, so you can put battery storage in today. Because I think that would, if you could make that economic, people would put battery storage in their homes tomorrow. And you could see a deployment really quickly that would start to balance the system off much more effectively. Next thing I would do is look at, we've got, the trouble is how do you get government to do big IT systems fast? I mean, if we could, there's a smart meter rollout basically. So we're going to put a smart meter in everybody's homes, but this smart meter isn't really smart. All it does is read meters and send a flow back. It doesn't help the householder control their household things. It doesn't turn the fridge off. It doesn't actually control anything. And if we could actually make all of those be much more effective, so each household could become an integration part of the grid, so that you could switch it on and switch it off permitted-wise. So those would be my kind of 3 big things that you do immediately. What else would you do? Those would be the big things.
Jeremy Corbyn's, at least the Labour's kind of tentative position, as far as I understand it at the moment, is renationalisation of lots of generating capacity, etc. What do people who work in the energy industry think of that?
I think it would be a huge distraction, a massive distraction. I think everybody else thinks so. Because if you think about the time it would take to do that, so first of all, you've got to value all those assets. Then you've got a bunch of companies who are basically lobbing their asses off to make sure they get maximum value back into their companies because of the nationalisation. So they then see pound signs in their eyes to get a load of money back. So you get caught in probably a 6 to 10 year process.
But there's a lamest solution to this.
What's that?
Expropriation.
If you want to do it that way. But in a world that we kind of... But the thing is, you can only do that if you have the power, and I'm afraid I just don't think we're able to do that. But if you want to renationalise everything, it will take time, and we haven't got that amount of time, basically. So we need to do it faster than that. So I think tinkering around with kind of, you can regulate it to move much quicker. I mean, green homes is the other thing, low carbon homes, basically saying every home has to be a zero carbon home when you build it. They remove that legislation, completely pointless. Construction industry is perfectly capable of delivering that, just need to do it.
I am very tempted to ask what you would say if Donald Trump called you tomorrow and asked you.
I don't think I'd answer the phone, to be honest.
Oh, because it will say real Donald Trump.
I don't know. I mean, America has huge. I mean, And parts of America have just got a huge opportunity. I mean, they've got brilliant technology. Google has been looking at this marketplace to see what activity it can have. It has some of the biggest solar parks, the biggest wind farms worldwide. If you start to look at those technological giants kind of working with integration on the Internet of Energy, you can have huge transformation. But I think Donald is stuck with his high carbon mates, and that's your biggest issue. Is are you ever going to get past them? So I don't think I'd say pick up the phone, to be honest, because I don't think it make any difference whatsoever.
All right. Well, okay.
You seem like quite an optimistic person, but if you're being honest, how optimistic are you for the planet?
I think you guys have got a massive challenge for the next 30 years.
And is there anything you think that you could kind of, if there was one take-home, one inspirational message that we could take away?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, you can fix it. I mean, it's not difficult to fix. This is not rocket science. Seriously, it's not rocket science. It's really easy science. The issue is people. The issue is politics. The issue is the fact that if you want to keep temperature below 2 degrees, you've got to leave something like 2/3 of the listed on the company listings balance sheet in the ground. So what you're asking a bunch of companies to do is to write off a bunch of assets they have in their balance sheets. And that's one of your biggest issues, is that we've got a system where everybody's got money in the ground, and you're going to say, leave it there. And they're going to go, whoa, why would I want to do that? So that's the biggest issue. The technological change you can do. I mean, as I said, we built 13 gigawatts of solar in the UK in 3 years. The transition can be done at speed. It's not a problem. The issue you've got is the incumbents are not going to like it. And what's really interesting for me about solar is solar took everybody by surprise. They didn't see it coming. If they'd seen it coming, they would have stopped it. So that, for me, is your inspiration. Just don't let them see you coming. Then you can overtake them.
All right, Merton, don't let them see you coming. On this note, they will see us coming soon into the hall. So let's thank our lecturer again.